Welcome back, everyone. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Kathleen DeRose, the director of the Fubon Center for Technology, Business, and Innovation. I hope you had a fantastic break and some great discussions in the breakout rooms, or just really enjoyed the sandwich. I'm really excited to introduce our next panel. This panel will be led by my colleague, Professor Arun Sundararajan, and a panel of experts on AI and specifically on trusting GPT. Please take it away, Arun.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm delighted to be leading this panel. I've got two really amazing AI researchers with me, Francesca, Rossi, and Vasant, Dhar, who I'll start off by introducing. We are then going to each spend about 5 minutes talking to you, giving you guys a presentation on sort of our research or academic perspective on different dimensions of the intersection of trust and AI. I'll kick it off by setting the stage, and talking about research over the last 10 years related to trust on digital interfaces. Francesca will then sort of lay out, how the scientific community views, sort of the determinants of trust in AI. And Professor Dhar Vasant will it feels weird calling you Professor Dhar. I'm just going to call you Francesca and Vasant. And Vasant will, sort of talk to us about, different FinTech contexts in which, sort of the introduction of AI might, be challenging or not challenging, looking at sort of trust as one dimension of trust as sort of being risk management. And so, to keep things efficient, I'll just do the introductions now, and then I'll, get into my talk. I'm thrilled to have these two colleagues here with me. Francesca Rossi is a computer scientist and, has been a professor was a professor for a number of years, primarily in Italy. But for the last few years, she has been leading AI ethics, at IBM. And she's one of the world's most important voices, on this topic of AI ethics and trust. She's currently the president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, AAAI, which is the most important academic organization relating to AI research. And has been a board member on the Partnership for AI, the Future of Life Institute, has chaired many World Economic Forum, Global Future Councils on AI. So we're thrilled to have you here with us, Francesca. Vasant Dhar, my colleague of many years, is a pioneering artificial intelligence researcher, also a data scientist. He brought machine learning to Wall Street in the 90s, and he's currently runs a machine learning based hedge fund, SCT Capital Management. He's also let me talk about his research first. His research really focuses on the topic of today, how risk influences our trust in AI systems. And I'm not going to get into the details. I'll let Vasant get into the details, but I did want to point you guys to his phenomenal podcast. I'm used to saying new podcast, but it's not really that new anymore. It's probably like episode 60 at this point. It's called Brave New World, and there's a dazzling array of guests, primarily focused on AI, but also from a wide variety of other scientific disciplines. All right, so welcome, guys. I'm going to start by kicking it off. I'm going to kick it off by just setting the stage for sort of what might we think about when we think about trusting systems like GPT. And, I thought I'd set the stage by, giving us a working definition for trust. I think of trust as a willingness to commit to a collaborative effort before you know how the other party will act. And so this is a seemingly simple definition, but it gives us a sense for what do we mean when we say trust. But it's a complex topic because I think people are talking about very different things when they talk about, or very different dimensions come into play when people are focused on trust between humans, and when people are talking about things like trust in the government, trust in the banks, trust in institutions. And the reason why I bring up this distinction is that it's interesting in the context of trusting AI, because AI, in some sense, or an AI system is not an individual, but it's sort of got an institution-like dimension to it. GPT is OpenAI's, Bard is Google's. But our nature of interaction with it feels like you're talking to someone else. And so I'm intrigued to sort of see whether the institutional or the bilateral trust aspects, sort of play a bigger role in determining whether we end up trusting AI. I've spent the last decade or more trying to understand what makes people trust through digital interfaces, through an interface like Google, through an interface like Airbnb, through an interface like Amazon, through an interface like eBay. Often it's another human on the other end. And, there are 6 lessons that I've learned that I'll go through 30 seconds each. First, I've learned that there is no universal set of things that you can do to make your system trustworthy. It's very heterogeneous. Different people trust what's on the other end based on different dimensions. Some people want a picture, some people want feedback from others, some people want sort of a government verified ID, some people want insurance, and this varies a lot across people. The second thing is that there is a very different set of trust dimensions depending on the context of commerce. Sort of buying a physical item has a very different set of trust levels from deciding to, rent a room in someone's home. Very different trust dimensions from getting into a stranger's car and saying, drive me to another city. I'm starting to see that with AI trust as well. The dimensions that determine whether you trust a medical chatbot are very different from the dimensions that, matter whether you trust a financial advisor. Third, it's path dependent, meaning that every individual takes their own trust path. Your early experiences and whether they work or not shape what you end up thinking are important. If you had good experiences the first 10 times you interacted digitally and there was a picture there, the data shows that you then sort of gravitate towards people who have pictures. The fourth thing I've learned is that you cannot build trust systems in isolation of the existing ones. The most successful platform trust companies are the ones who have built a brand as well. They rely on government-based trust. They rely on economic institutions. They rely on sort of interpersonal trust. And so it's sort of like, a stack, and then on the top is the digital trust. The fifth thing I've learned is that human beings get more and more sophisticated with technology over time. And so the same system that might have been untrustworthy in 2011, exactly the same system, feels trustworthy in 2016 because individual experiences and sophistication and comfort with dealing with a digital interface has changed. And so trust evolves even if the system doesn't. And finally, and related, people are much more comfortable with digital systems if it's part of the cultural dialogue. I'll give you the example of Airbnb, even though this isn't related to AI. In 2012, people didn't trust Airbnb. They're like, sort of, I don't know. Exactly the same thing in 2017, they trust, not because of their sophistication, but because now it's become part of the dialogue, your friends staying at Airbnb. So in the context of AI, I think heterogeneity, context specificity, and path dependence are all going to kick in. I think that as more and more of our friends start to sort of use medical chatbots or financial advisor chatbots, the same financial advisor chatbot is going to end up seeming trustworthy to us because it's been socially legitimized. And I'll end with a question and then hand it off to Francesca, which is that when we're looking at these new large language model-based systems like ChatGPT, sitting inside them is the pre-trained large language model, which is just spitting out words based on the prompts that you give it, right? And a question that I've been thinking about is this the layer at which you have to sort of try and design the system to be trustworthy, to sort of generate sort of sequences of words that make the other people feel like, they can commit to this collaborative effort? Or is it going to be that the LLMs are going to be fundamentally untrustworthy? They're fundamentally going to make, the LLMs make up everything that they say. This is just how they're designed. Are they going to continue to keep hallucinating and making things up? And is it going to be up to the people like, OpenAI scientists who have created these guardrails and this dialogue management? Is this the layer at which trust is going to be built based on conversation style, based on the guardrails you put in place? All right, so I just wanted to sort of set the stage, define trust, some lessons from platform trust, throw out a question there. I'll now hand it off to Francesca, who, will talk to us about the key trust issues that have come up, relating to AI.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and participate into this important discussion. So yes, I will try to touch upon this link between trust and AI. And the title is about trust in AI. Can AI be trusted? But I think that AI has a role also in impacting also the trust between people and between people and institutions. So it's a kind of bi-directional thing, because AI capabilities at this point, and we will see some of them, are possibly impacting also the trust between people because of the possible, misinformation or other things. So I think that this relationship between trust and AI, between AI and people, is bi-directional. So first of all, a brief history of AI. So I'm sure that everybody knows about generative AI, foundation models, and so on. But AI is a long history, more than 60 years, that started with trying to replicate in a machine the way we reason and we logically make inferences in our mind and solve problems. And then in the 80s, it started using data-driven approaches, so machine learning, where machines learn from data to solve problems rather than being told by us all the steps to solve problems. These were already there in the 80s, but they couldn't really be usable because there was not enough data and not enough compute power to handle those data. So then this usability of machine learning approaches came about only much later, where at the same time the deep learning capabilities came about to allow these neural networks, these machine learning approaches, to really deal with much better with the amount of data that was needed. And now we have generative AI, which allows machines not only, like machine learning was already doing, to interpret content like voices, vocal commands, images, and text, but also to generate content of various kinds. And these various capabilities of AI, that it's not that one replaced the other one. Even in the picture, I try to give the idea that are all of them, having their own role inside AI. But of course, some of them are more visible now than others. So there are several trust dimensions that we were already considering and studying and trying to address in non-generative AI, so in the previous wave of AI. And of course, one of them has to do with privacy, because AI, machine learning, needs a lot of data and can include personal data, also uncurated data. So, of course, it's very important that privacy of this data is handled in the right way. With generative AI, this is still present, and it's still even expanded, because now AI can generate content that instead is protected by IP or is private. It should be kept private. The fairness issue is really very central, or was already very central, and now even more, because, of course, bias can be embedded in the training data, in the model, or even in the value alignment that we use to align these machines to our values. But this was already true with non-generative AI. But now with generative AI that needs to be trained on much larger training data, which are not curated, really needs, it makes it even more challenges to handle the issue of fairness and to recognize bias, or to make the training data more balanced, for example. Then there is the issue of explainability, which again was already present in non-generative AI, but is also expanded now, because explainability has to do with these machines that are having the behavior, which is kind of a black box. We don't know sometimes how the output comes from the input. And this was already true with machine learning approaches, not with symbolic AI. But now it's even more true because it's difficult to understand what part of the training data, if any, generated a specific content that is produced by the machine. Robustness was also an issue that we were been working a lot because AI can be very sensitive to small changes in the distribution of the data, in the deployment, in the distribution of the deployment scenario, and also now in the input prompt injection, prompt leaking, and so on. So robustness in the behavior of the machine. Added by generative AI, there are those that have to do with the content that is generated. So one of them is misinformation, and this is because now AI can generate, for example, large language models can generate very plausible content, but not correct. So in technical terms, this is called hallucinations, where all the training data may contain perfectly correct information, but still you have some incorrect content that is generated. Then you have value alignment, which is referred to by Arun also, that AI can generate content that is harmful. So, for example, text that is offensive, abusive, aggressive, racist, and I agree with, I mean, I don't know if agree is the right word because he's posing a question, but I deeply think that we still don't have good ways of achieving value alignment. Right now, the only ways that we have as a research community is to put something at the end. So like a filter from the output, as you put in your picture, Arun. But I really think we need additional technologies to really embed value alignment from the start of the development of generative AI. Deep fakes are another thing that AI can generate content that it looks very realistic. You may have seen even a content of the Pope, recently. So images, videos, and text to impersonate somebody without consent. There are also trust dimensions that have to do not just with the behavior of these machines, but also with the social impact that they have. One is the inclusion aspect. So sometimes this deployment and the use of the machine increases the social gaps. And this should not be so because it increases the gaps between those that can use the machine, those that cannot use it, and so on. So the other one is that they generate a very fast transformation of our society, that education and the other societal actors have difficulty to keep up and to adapt. They can exploit human work and for example, in the training of these machines and also in the training of the reinforcement, the learning with human beings. And they can also displace or change in any way the jobs landscape. The other issue is that sometimes AI can be used in a way that manipulates people. So it impacts on human and moral agency. As we said, this AI system, especially the latest wave of AI system, they really need a huge amounts of data and computing power. So this creates also an environmental impact for training and developing these machines. And this generates also a power imbalance because not everybody can have access to that amount of data and that amount of computing power. The last trust dimensions that I want to point out, they have to do with governance and policy challenges, because it's very important to focus on transparency and audit for these machines, whether internal audit or by third parties. And so it's important to be able to collect enough information on how the system is being built to be used by others that are going to use that model or by external auditors. Accountability, there are already several regulations regulations about accountability, but it's not that easy to understand who is responsible for the possible harm, because at this point, AI is a very complex value chain from the designers to the users and everybody in between in the value chain. Risk assessment is not easy to measure the risk of an AI system once deployed, and many policies and regulation proposals like the European AI Act are risk-based on the AI systems and AI users. So it's not really easy to understand how can AI systems and not AI as a technology of a research field be regulated without stopping innovation and value, but addressing the risks. The last point that I want to make is that in the last several years, I used to say that we passed through three phases. One, identification of the issues related to trust and ethics in AI. Second phase, identified the principles, and everybody, corporation, government, academia, civil, everybody was writing principles around AI. And then the third phase, which was translation of principle into practice. But at this point, with the new wave of AI that introduces additional issues, we need really a loop, because as AI evolves, also the frameworks, the solutions, which are usually socio-technical solutions, need to evolve as well. So now we are in the practice phase for the initial issues, but we are also identifying new issues and defining new principles and new practices. So I'll stop here and welcome any question later on.
Thank you, Francesca. Before I hand off to Vasant, audience members, I know some of you have already started doing this. Please do type questions into the Q&A if you have them as we go along. And if we will spend some time at the end addressing audience questions.
Thank you, Arun. Thanks, Francesca. So as Arun mentioned, it's just very timely. My last episode of Brave New World featured Raphael Millier from Columbia University talking about language models, and we sort of really went under the hood. That was the last episode just released yesterday. And 2 episodes before that, I had Sam Bowman, who's a natural language guru at the Center for Data Science, and we sort of went, fairly deep into ChatGPT and its implications. So check those out. I really enjoyed those podcasts, and people have told me that they liked them a lot. That's episode 58 and 60, if you want to deep dive into these. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 specific sort of use cases within finance. Systematic trading is something I've been sort of most involved in since the 90s. And then I'll also talk a little bit about lending, commercial lending and commercial insurance underwriting, which sort of just coincidentally, I got sort of involved in because the head of a insurance division heard my podcast with Danny Kahneman on noise, and Kahneman had actually looked at noise within the insurance industry. He looked at a specific company and found that there was a huge amount of variance in underwriters' decisions, and we talked about that in the podcast. And then I got sort of pulled into doing a research project with an insurance company that's very interesting, and I'll mention that as well. So my experience has been that for most of my career, I've actually seen a lot of resistance to AI. For the most part, people didn't trust it. They didn't buy it. There was always suspicion. When I sort of brought machine learning to Wall Street in the 90s, people didn't want to buy it. It was just like, what is this stuff? It's nonlinear. You can't prove theorems about it. It was just like it's been a tough slog getting people to sort of buy into it. Whereas on the other hand, now everyone and his brother seems to be into it. And I'll just pick up on something Arun said, which I regard as herd mentality. People trust something if everyone else trusts it, right? And that's kind of the way I see trust in AI as also evolving. Suddenly, all the big people are doing it, so we better do it, right? So suddenly now there's a huge frenzy among banks, among companies saying, like, what is this thing? Right? We better get on it. Whereas the same people 5 years ago would have said, get out of here. Like, what is this crap? Right? So it's just, it's a herd mentality kind of thing. The other thing I'll say is, I was on Wall Street during the 90s when the internet was emerging, and it's the same kind of thing I'm seeing now, right? At that point, people said, what is this thing, right? Why are these companies worth billions of dollars that don't produce anything? There was just like a complete mind shift around valuation and how value is created, sort of going from, a view of sort of physical assets to digital assets, right? That took a while for people to sort of get their head around. So there's generally a lot of resistance with things that are not familiar, but once people get into it, boom, the floodgates open and you get the sort of herd mentality, which is really what's going on in AI now. So just a somewhat abstract framework that I use to think about trust is this sort of heat map that I first published in the Harvard Business Review about 7 years ago. And this is based on sort of 20, 30 years of building machine learning applications in several areas of finance, but also in other areas like sports, advertising, supply chains, et cetera. And the question I always asked myself was, why was I willing to trust an algorithm with managing sort of, financial decisions in a hedge fund where the computer is wrong almost half the time? Whereas, I wasn't willing to trust a machine with, let's say, a medical decision. I wanted a human doctor to tell me what's going on, right? So same thing with sports. And so when I, 20, 25 years later, I sort of said, here's a way to think about it in terms of two dimensions of risk. One I call predictability, which is, how often are you wrong? And the other is the cost of error, which is when you're wrong, how bad is it? How bad can it be? And to me, it was a confluence of these two things that influence trust. And I sort of think of a monotonic sort of line, an automation frontier that connects the bottom left to the top right. And to the right of it, we are more willing to trust machines. When, errors are few and their consequences are not disastrous, we're much more willing to trust machines than we are otherwise. And so, and between these two zones is what I call the automation frontier, where at the moment it's humans plus machines making decisions. And when I think of sort of applying this to areas, so trading, I see as lying on the sort of bottom left, lots of mistakes, but also relatively low cost of error, especially if you keep your risk per position really low, right? So that's where trading falls. Lending is somewhere in the middle, but lending is sort of interesting because there's negotiation involved, at least in commercial lending. I'm not talking about like small loans, which you may be able to automate, but loans that carry substantial risk, right? So the cost of error is reasonably high. So even when the machine says, yes, give the loan, you always sort of look at it and want to verify and then negotiate, right? So there's also negotiation involved, which is, yeah, I'll give you the loan, but you're risky on some factor. So how about putting up another point, right? So that's the kind of stuff that goes on in negotiation that humans do. In this area of lending, I got involved in a very interesting project a few years ago where a lending company asked me to help basically set up that data science operation involving dealing with unstructured data, namely text and images. The idea being, can we use the image of a house to tell what condition it's in? Or can we look at the description of a house in the MLS to infer something about the house? The results from that were really, really interesting. Very high levels of performance. But the question that the leaders of the business asked, like, why should we trust these things? What's really going on under the hood? Can we get some more visibility into what's going on? And that's one of the most important factors in people actually adopting these kinds of systems. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. And more recently, as I mentioned, I've gotten involved in a sort of substantial research project involving underwriting, where the head of the business said, I'd like to improve the underwriting process. I don't want to replace humans. I want to improve them. And that's a very interesting question, which is, how do you really combine AI with human decision-making to improve things? Because, contrary to what a lot of people think, that somehow humans and machines will be better than machines, my experience in finance has been to the contrary, that when you actually sort of mess with a system, you tend to mess it up, right? So if you've built it right and you've done the math correctly, you should basically let it go as opposed to messing with it. But this is a really interesting question at the moment. And again, I'll be happy to answer, to get into some more detail during the Q&A. And the open question right now is, will ChatGPT do sort of the verification and negotiation as well going forward? And I would argue that it should be able to do a lot of this going ahead. That is sort of, more of the human role as well. So just some sort of philosophical issues, right? Francesca touched on bias, right? Bias is everywhere. In fact, in finance, oftentimes bias is the objective, right? You want to lend to people who will pay you back, right? So you're biased towards lending to people who pay you back, right? So it's almost like that's part of the objective. Existing data is incomplete, so we use proxies to estimate bias. One of the sort of very interesting questions is, what happens to the insurance industry when everything is known, right? What if your genetics tell you everything about your risk for disease? Well, what happens there, right? When everything that's knowable is known. And this is also an interesting question going forward when we think about how AI might impact business, because I remember in the 90s when the internet was emerging and we were doing sort of scenario analyses at Morgan Stanley, someone said, what could happen? And the scenarios were like, imagine a world where information is instantaneously available from anywhere, anytime, right? Which is a foreign concept at the time. We take it for granted now. But, we sort of walk through the implications of that. And that's sort of worth considering here now as well with AI, because there's a lot of stuff that was not known earlier that will be known. What are the implications of that? Noise is everywhere. I referred to, Daniel Kahneman's book called Noise. It's there in justice, healthcare, social media, everywhere. And pre-trained AI systems train on everything. So they also have the bias and the noise embedded in them as well. Regulation is very challenging, but the societal risks are extremely high. And so this is something where we need to do something, but it isn't clear what needs to be done. My sense is that data is the key. That is the access to data. And I like sort of the Indian approach to this, which is sort of thinking in terms of data empowerment and giving people control of their data, because I think this will become even more important going forward. The one thing we've learned from Web 2.0 is that data is where a lot of the value was. In the next generation of systems, this will be even more the case when we start sharing really intimate data with the machine. And let me just end with, I said, people talk about sort of AI Bill of Rights. I think maybe it's time to think about the liabilities associated with AI, because these things will arise. AI will begin to make mistakes. It'll begin to go off the rails. All kinds of things will happen. So it's a good time to think about liability. And I guess the question is there an equivalent of or better version of Section 230 for AI, right? That's a good question to be thinking about, because there are some things we did not think about in Section 230, which in retrospect, we should have thought about when we thought about, facilitating innovation. So let me just stop here. I did ask ChatGPT, by the way, why, will people trust AI in finance? And it gave me this interesting answer. Yes, because, AI will be more accurate, it'll be more efficient, it'll be objective, it'll be consistent, it'll be transparent, and it'll be adaptive, right? So why wouldn't people trust AI in finance, right? So this is what ChatGPT says about whether AI will trust, we will trust AI. Thank you for that.
All right. Thanks, Vasant. We've got could you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
All right. So we've got about 15, maybe 20 minutes for Q&A. We have a few questions that we wanted to discuss, but there's also sort of a growing set of questions on the Q&A that we can sort of start to get to. But I thought I'd start with maybe two quick questions, one to Francesca and one to Vasant. So for Francesca, what's the you identified a number of dimensions of AI governance that sort of are very broad in terms of us thinking about how should we deal with these exciting yet sort of threatening new technologies. Like if you had to pinpoint one that is particularly related to people's trust in AI, we've got to get this right for people to trust AI. I mean, which one would it be?
Well, first of all, I would distinguish between governance as regulation from governments and governance of AI within an AI company or a company using AI or producing AI. So there are two different things. But I think in both cases, a common thing that needs to be there is the multi-stakeholder consultations. Definitely, governance cannot be put in place in the right way without a multi-stakeholder conversation where there are those that are expert in the technology, but also those that are expert in understanding the impact of the technology on people and society, and also those that are impacted themselves by the use of technology in their life. So very multi-stakeholder conversation in both situations, both the governance within a company and so on. And then there are many other things like as I mentioned, the solutions that the governance can put in place should be socio-technical, like at IBM or in other technical company. It's very easy to think that issues with the technology can be resolved with more technology, with more tools. Okay, you have a problem bias, I build you a tool that can detect and mitigate bias. Yeah. But I think that I think you recognize at this point and at IBM, but I think also in other companies, is that you need a mix of technical tools, but also more human-centered solutions like education, consultations, diversity in the teams, playbooks for our developers. So a lot of different, and risk assessment. So a lot of different pieces beyond the technical tools to handle these issues with the technology. And then on the governance, in terms of government regulation side, I think that, as you say, as also Vasant said, is a challenge because it's not easy to understand the risks, evaluate the risks, and also, but I think that a risk-based approach is the best one, and focused on the risk of the uses of the technology. Because if you start going upstream and want to focus on the risk of the technology per se, that's very dangerous because you are putting constraints on the technology, on the research of the technology, which is actually where you should be able actually to do even more there to be able to understand.
That sounds really. I mean, can you give us an example of that? That seems like an important distinction.
Yeah.
Right,
so, for example, in the European AI Act, it was originally designed as a full risk-based approach on the AI systems, meaning not on AI, but on the risk of using AI. So, for example, in using the AI in HR or in critical systems and so on. So, when you had those high-risk scenarios, using AI in those high-risk scenarios, it was labeled high risk, and then you had all sorts of obligations because it was high risk. Now, with the foundation models and generative AI, there is a discussion about considering the technology per se, before you know when it's going to and how it's going to be used, as high risk. So you see that there is a possible shift upstream when you build the technology rather than downstream when you use it. And I don't think that's a good move.
Okay. I mean, we may come back to that based on sort of one of the questions that we've asked. But Vasant, my question for you is sort of much more, while I know you sort of are equally happy in the philosophical and the pragmatic realm, I'm sort of going down the pragmatic realm. I mean, given that, sort of you're one of the few people around who has sort of deep expertise in both finance and AI sort of for many decades. If you look at this new generation of, generative AI, I mean, both you and Francesca in separate frameworks that I've seen sort of think of it as a next generation of AI, sort of like a fourth generation, right? Expert systems, machine learning, deep learning, and now this. So, where do you think in finance the impact is going to be the greatest? Just to sort of put that, we've seen a ton of impact from tech in general and from certain kinds of sort of predictive systems in certain areas of consumer finance and sort of systematic trading. With the generative AI, where do you think the impact is going to be?
Great question. I wish I had a crystal ball. It's very difficult, sort of the Yogi Berra.
I'm thinking of you as our collective crystal ball here. So.
I realize that. But I guess it depends on two things, right? So if I think in terms of which way regulation goes, and assuming that there's no regulation or there's very little regulation, which seems very likely given the US approach. So if there's little regulation, then, could Microsoft, for example, become a player in finance, right? That's feasible. At the same time, what will sort of the generational shifts look like? Is Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, are we going to see sort of lower touch kinds of things going forward as opposed to high touch, which is what finance has, traditionally been. In that case, I think that, these pre-trained models have huge numbers of applications, that are even hard to envision at the moment, both on the, on the customer side, in terms, applications in terms of, trading, insurance, asset management, right? I think all of these things are going to be impacted by AI, right? I mean, when you talk about selling, it's a question of, okay, who do I approach with what, when? That's the kind of stuff that I think machines will be able to do, as well or even better than humans. So I see this happening already. Like Morgan Stanley's got this system called Next Touch or something like that, which is, who do you approach with what now? Like who's likely to respond to something? So
there's a question, for example, in the Q&A about do you foresee sort of completely automated commercial lending?
It depends. It depends on that cost of error axis. If the risks are low, yes, right. But on the other hand, if the risks are high, then you're going to see humans in the loop to sort of make sure that everything's okay. Because ultimately, the responsibility rests with a human, right? You can't blame the AI for making a bad loan. You're going to blame humans or people running the operation for doing that. So.
But you don't see an opportunity for the conversational AI to sort of start to take over some of the.
It's already happening. It's already happening. It's already happening, right? So that's already happening. That train has left the station.
Okay, I mean it's because it's sort of a scary thought because in part there's I think we're being seduced by the human likeness of ChatGPT and its peers, without sort of having thought carefully about whether they have other human characteristics, like sort of judgment and beyond empathy and other things. But I think that we're at a risky point where the humanness along certain dimensions, like being able to converse like a human, may cause people to sort of mistakenly assume that they possess other kinds of intelligence.
Yeah, that's one of the also issue, this over attribution of capabilities. Now you see a certain property, like to be able to write text in a very fluent and eloquent way, and you try to attribute, and you tend to attribute other capabilities. But I wanted to say something about this topic of using these systems in enterprise applications, whether it's finance or other sectors. I think that in those kind of applications, the trust needs a higher bar of quality in some sense, rather than open domain or something that is maybe less risky, like recommendations for the book to buy or whatever. So you need a higher quality in order to trust technology there. But at the same time, the fact that you are focusing on a specific task rather than an open domain chatbot, for example, where you can ask questions about any topic, it helps you, I think, mitigate some of the risks, because you can train on trusted training data, for example, that comes from that enterprise, rather than everything on the web that you're not vetted, it's not curated. So there is a balance between, yes, you need more quality and more less risky, but you also are helped in achieving this goal in the fact that you are focusing to a specific application inside an enterprise.
Okay, I just want to add a quick comment to something Francesca said, because I think quality is really important, but the bar varies a lot across applications, right? If you're as good as a human in making a recommendation or slightly better, that's plenty fine. Even if you make lots of wrong recommendations, because humans do as well. So I think the bar varies. As long as you're above the bar, I think people will tend to. AI will tend to be used, and people will tend to trust it.
Okay, so we're in our last 5 minutes, amazingly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of pull 3 questions from the Q&A and just sort of put them out there that you guys can answer any and all. And there are lots of really good questions. I'll try and sort of stick around, and we can stick around and try and answer them in the chat as well. One of them that came in early had to do with mitigating bias. Is this something that sort of has to be done by eliminating sort of bias in training data points, and if so, for a system at the scale of sort of these GPT things, is that even feasible, or sort of do you have to just sort of adjust for it later? So that's one question. I think a second question, and there are a couple of people who are asking this sort of is around audit. Sort of, is there, and the NTIA has also sort of put out a call, for sort of how do we audit these AI systems? I think one of the questions, sort of from, I'm trying to find the person who asked it, Abhishek, I think, talks about, will a big 3 auditing kind of infrastructure sort of help increase trust, or is it going to be some other sort of API-based system? And I think Adam alluded to this as well. And then there's a third question, which is the question that we've all been asked like 20 times in the last few days, which is like, what do we think about that open letter that, sort of sadly is being called the Elon Musk letter, but this letter we're talking about that says 6-month moratorium on, and this goes back to your point, Francesca, about do we want to sort of squeeze the source rather than the use? So I'll leave those out there, and we've got 3 minutes. Take whichever ones you want.
Okay, 1 minute. Bias, yes, it's true. It's more difficult to address bias in the training data because it's so uncurated and structured and so on. But or even before generative AI, we were addressing the issue of bias in the training data, in the model, in the output. So now we have to adapt these bias frameworks to the new situation where it's more challenges to do it in the training data if it's not curated. But as I said, in enterprise application, you can still work with a lot of data that is curated.
Yeah.
Second,
but the within that enterprise context, just a really quick point, if you're building it on a pre-trained LLM, then you're at the mercy in some sense of its training data, right? And so that's a trade-off.
Yeah, but you have the other two the kind of mechanism to detect and mitigate bias. On the audit, I think the audit requires transparency, requires sharing what people have done to build a certain AI system. So definitely that's something that needs to be there also for downstream applications based on that model. So definitely that's going to be, I think, a big part, whether it's an audit between a company and the client of that company, or whether it's an external party audit or something. The third one, the Future of Life letter, I did not sign it, although I am a member of the scientific advisory board of the Future of Life Institute. I did not sign it because, again, as I said, it focuses on upstream. It focuses on the training part, so the research and development part, which I don't think is the right focus for policies. Second, it is worded in a way that it seems like current systems or future system a human-like intelligence, which I don't think is true, and we should not communicate in that way, because otherwise people really perceive that over attribution and so on. And third element is that because first of all, it's not enforceable, even if everybody agreed on that post, it would not be enforceable. It would not be able to check whether companies do that or not.
Okay, and Vasant, maybe I'll sort of hand over the last couple of minutes to you.
So I'll just take 30 seconds. The open letter, well-intentioned, I think it's a little too late. I think we should be worrying about sort of more practical issues now that the genies are the bottle. What do we do? Like, how do we think in terms of risks and liabilities? On the bias side, that's a great question, but I think it'll boil down to sort of application-specific kinds of ways to deal with bias. So there's no general answer to that question. The auditing body, I think it's a great idea. I just wonder whether explainable AI is a hope and wishful thinking, because everything I'm seeing about AI is veering towards more and more complexity, larger and larger models, where we don't have any idea what's going on. I was at this philosophy of deep learning workshop a couple of weeks ago, where one of the questions was, are these systems even understandable in principle, right? That is, can we understand them through a symbolic lens, which is the way humans tend to understand something? Or might their representations be so distributed and sort of at a sub-symbolic level that we can't even understand them, that they're inherently ununderstandable, right? So that's my fear. So while I think it's a noble research objective to pursue explainable AI, it's a very elusive one.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Francesca and Vasant, thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, you're both sort of really deep thinkers on this topic, so I'm really glad that the audience had the benefit of your expertise. Thank you, Kathleen, for inviting us. I always encourage people to over-attribute capabilities to me. So with that closing thought, enjoy the next panel. Stick around.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you. Thanks all.
That was amazing. Thanks so much to the three of you. It was a fantastic discussion of the frameworks that we can use to think about the issue, the futures of finance, and how we're all kind of pushing on the frontier. So if you guys, thank you so much, really. It was great. It's terrific.